of presentation by Dr. Clare Matysova, and she's going to talk to us about parents planning care in the higher education context. Dr. Clare Matysova is a EDI program manager at Health Data Research UK, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to hear about her really important research, really focused on the higher education sector. I've met Clare before in conferences, and really kind of admire the work she's done in revealing what's going on in this sector. So I'll hand over to Clare now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you for inviting me to do this presentation. So I'm got multiple hats, I guess. So I work at Health Data Research UK as EDI program manager, and also have recently just completed my PhD at the University of Leeds. And I'm also a mum of 3 children. So I come at this topic of parents planning care in the HE context from various different angles. So I wanted to think about parental leave in relation to gender equality in higher education, and why do I focus on parental leave and how it links to gender equality. It's kind of known that the transition to parenthood is inextricably linked to the gender pay gap, as shown by this kind of visual chart. And I want to think about it in terms of the employer's role in supporting that transition and how it impacts on gender equality. So the gender pay gap provides a snapshot of gender inequality in a specific context. So in the higher education sector in the UK, gender pay gap is currently at 10%. So it has gone down over the recent years, but it is still 10%. But it varies quite considerably between higher education institutions, from 0% to 41% is the highest it was in 2023. Generally, there is evidence, across all sectors, that parental leave policy impacts the gender pay gap by facilitating more equal sharing of care during a child's first year. As the gender pay gap varies in the higher education and other sectors, so does employer enhancement and implementation of parental leave. So it's kind of quite a complex picture. The Higher Education Policy Institute wrote a blog, Rose Stevenson, in last year, I think it was, and she was looking at gender pay gap across the sector, and was asking me, because she'd read that I was doing some work around parental leave, and kind of in looking at the data she was looking at, I noticed that where there was a smaller gap between parental leave, there was a smaller pay gap as well. So I was just kind of really interested to look at that in more detail. So the aim of the presentation is to kind of recognise and reflect on employers' roles in relation to parental leave, employer enhancement, implementation of parental leave. And I'm drawing on a freedom of information request, and I'll also draw a bit on my PhD research findings. Oh, so sorry, I've said that. So what I will go through is I'll talk first about how gender justice is framed. So how do we think about that gender equality, gender equity? And then I'll provide an overview of the current parental leave, as I said, from the freedom of information request. And then I will draw on some of my PhD study findings around parents' experiences when planning care. So thinking about how gender justice is framed, it's kind of variously, there's so much work and debate and out there in terms of what gender equality means or gender justice means, or social justice in general. And I drew in my studies, I drew on Nancy Fraser's work, her article on After the Family Wage, which she sets out a number of standpoints and tries to kind of analyse how they differ and what the underlying principles underpinning those standpoints differ. And those 3 kind of standpoints here is the equality of opportunity, which is generally quite often see in university equality, diversity and inclusion strategies around promoting equality of opportunity, and very much driven by the Equality Act, and a focus on that, opportunity. So you might, in relation to gender justice, you might then see kind of a focus on recruitment or bringing women into employment, women in leadership, that kind of thing. Whereas if you contrast that with parental leave policies, in the UK very much a gender differentiating, and that maternity leave is different from paternity leave, that kind of thing. And there's a focus on kind of a right to care, which generally prioritizes women. And then you kind of, the third one is the gender equity, which Nancy Fraser calls universal caregiver, but she's really talking about kind of thinking about the underpinning structural barriers and the normative part of that as well. So she thinks about it. Whereas the gender differentiate may be responding to kind of material kind of impact of differences of women having to take leave, she would kind of like unpick that a bit further and think about it in terms of kind of removing those structural barriers, but also the normative expectations that it's the women that do the care. So I'm kind of interested in how do universities, they're thinking about the HE sector, how do we think about gender equity, but specifically in relation to parental leave? Because we know there's quite a lot of like talk about, oh, gender equity, we need to equity rather than equality, but how's that reflected in our approach to family leave policies? So a little bit on the parental leave policy context in the UK. So we have a legacy of long maternity leave, kind of driven by that kind of historical discrimination against women, and recognising as well the physiological demands. So to provide protection from detrimental employment risks. So i.e. is a gender differentiating kind of historically approach. And shared parental leave was introduced in 2015, but very much a language of choice. So you've got that equality of opportunity kind of language. Meanwhile, you've still got that gender differentiating kind of in the policy, in that it's based on maternal transfer. So the assumption is generally the women will take leave, but if they don't, they can transfer all of it, so they can transfer some to their partner. So you've kind of got that conflicting kind of standpoint. And then paternity leave was introduced quite late relative to to other countries, and has made little progress then. So it was introduced in 2001, I think, and then the shared element through additional paternity leave was introduced in 2011, and then shared parental leave 2015. So but the paternity leave bit hasn't really moved on at all. So that's the kind of context. And then you've got the employer's role. So whereas you've got the statutory, quite low kind of statutory leave, there's quite a lot of variation across employers about how they enhance that leave. So what does it look like in the HE sector specifically? So this is where I'm drawing on my freedom of information request. So 96% of HEIs enhance their maternity leave, which compares to 72% of employers across through I think it was Bright Horizons benchmark. And that 96% of enhanced ranges from something above 0 up to 52 weeks. So it's a real kind of range of what's offered. And the average is 18 weeks. So that's generally what you'll see is 18 weeks. If we compare that to paternity leave, most institutions do enhance, but on average it's 2 weeks. Some are less and some slightly more. And about 62% match shared parental leave to maternity leave, and that hasn't really moved since I think UCEA did a benchmark in 2016 for higher education, and it hasn't really shifted much since then. And then approximately 20 universities have removed their minimum eligibility criteria to the enhanced leave. So where mostly you have to have been employed for 6 months, some 12 months to get that enhanced element of the pay, 20 have removed that altogether. So that's quite an interesting when you're thinking again about the different framing of gender justice. So I tried to put this in a bit of a visual. So again, we've got this 96%, 6 weeks, average 18 weeks, but we've got quite a complex. This, I've summarized it, but if you actually look at all the different offers out there's so many different variations of, the full 18 weeks, or you can have 9 weeks full, 18 weeks half, and then all the very different variations of that. But we've only got this small amount that only offer the statutory. If we compare that to paternity, so the blue, let me put the next one. You can see that's quite a stark difference between the number that are enhancing it to something above, the statutory basic. and the statutory for paternity leave, I should have said, is that you don't have any enhanced statutory, whereas you do have 6 weeks enhanced, 90% for statutory maternity leave. So it's quite a big difference, and there is that kind of like recognizing the the need for that. The mothers are obviously going through quite demanding physiological time, breastfeeding, that kind of thing. But does that reflect such a stark difference between 2 weeks and paid leave potentially for dads and 18 weeks? There's such a big difference. Okay. And then I wanted to just pull out a few case studies as well as to how universities are approaching this differently. So London Met, for example, they recently doubled both their maternity leave and their paternity leave to 52 weeks compared to 8 weeks. So 52 weeks maternity, 8 weeks paternity. University of Exeter was one of the first universities that removed the eligibility criteria. University of the Arts London in 2022 offered equalised leave, so quite different from London Met. So one's equalised and the other one's kind of doubled, but there's still quite a big difference between them. And then we've got, I think it was Cambridge and then Oxford, that have increased their paternity leave quite recently. So the gap, again, between their maternity, I think they increased their maternity as well, but the gap is less between the maternity and paternity. So just quickly kind of reflecting on that, so that in terms of those different kind of standpoints on gender equality, you've got, like I said, in your Athena Swan, in your EDI action plan, quite a focus on women in leadership, that kind of thing. And then your parental leave, there will sometimes be reference to it, but quite often, having sat on Athena Swan panels for about 10 years, quite often if there is any mention of family leave, it's maternity, not paternity or shared parental leave. So quite a gender differentiating. So they're kind of in contrast. But then we have got some universities that have got that, they focused on equalised leave, or the gap between the leaves is reduced. And then those few that are removing the eligibility barriers, which I should have said is really important in the HE context, given the amount of people on precarious contracts. So people that are moving from one institution to another, really kind of out of their control because it's linked to funding. And then being able to kind of manage or planning a family, that kind of thing, makes it really difficult. So that removal of the eligibility criteria is really crucial. Okay, so I just wanted to draw now just a little bit on my PhD research findings, just to kind of reflect on how parents are thinking about these things and how the policies kind of impact on parents' decision making. So my research focused on how parents kind of planned their leave, but I really wanted to focus on how gendered parenting norms shaped their decision making. Quite often when you talk about shared parental leave, my PhD did focus on shared parental leave. Quite often when you talk about shared parental leave and why there's low take up, it's the focus on finance and the poor kind of pay, which obviously is completely really important. But the gendered parenting norms is also really important, and the fact that the shared parental leave is based on maternal transfer. And I looked at how employers' kind of implementation of the policy shaped that normative element as well. So I won't go into this much, but having kind of like gender justice was a key thread through my PhD. So I was conscious of those debates that I've talked about between kind of equality of opportunity and those gender differentiating positions. I drew on the capability approach, which has got choice as a really important element to it. It's about looking at people's ability to do what is of value to them, to be and to do what is of value to them. And it's been adapted within social policy to be able to explore that disjuncture between aspiration and what's actually achieved. So it's got that choice element, but in the context of constrained choice and thinking about norms. But in the various literature on capability approaches, recognise that it's really difficult to kind of explore the normative element, and what is identified as valued might be constrained in terms of what's actually perceived as imaginable. So it's trying to understand that and explore that is quite difficult. So I attempted to do that by drawing on gender as discursive and looking at narratives and small stories that parents drew on when they were explaining their decision making. I held 6 online discussions with parents and then 12 couple interviews. And from those findings, I had out 6 themes in terms of what was of value to parents when caring. When planning care, as shown on the slide here. So shared parenting, postnatal wellbeing, spending time with baby, financial security and career aspirations, and then gender justice as well. So like I said, my research looked at the discursive resources and essentially the kind of power and privilege just accessed through those discursive resources, and parents' various positioning of themselves and other in relation to, for example, time with baby or financial rationales, which provided insight into how parents navigated those gendered parenting expectations to either value this time with baby or to fulfill financial protection. And my empirical findings showed how the current use of discursive resources such as treasure time, so that kind of you should treasure treasure time, it goes so quickly, was like a really strong kind of narrative discursive resource throughout. Similarly, financial kind of rationales and the treasuring of time was really kind of evoked as an irrefutable kind of, felt like a moral imperative to prioritize that time, and was felt more by, it's gendered, so felt more by expectant mothers than fathers. And this idealization of motherhood kind of reflected that kind of intensive parenting literature, where motherhood is almost a sacred endeavor and cost is not, no cost is considered too high. Yet that differs in terms of paid employment and how you kind of look at that in the different kind of spheres. In relation to paid employment and financial rationales, identifying the boundaries around what was included as valuable revealed what was kind of more silent, where narratives around finances were kind of, or outsourcing time with baby was kind of described as merely load bearing. So it was really kind of trying to explore those different narratives and how they were drawn on. And like I say, it was kind of like time with baby, I couldn't give it up. You can never get it back, and how that interacted with the economic time that was merely load bearing. How can you differentiate what's load bearing to what's not? That kind of building a relationship with an individual and all of that effective kind of care, how do you differentiate that from the load bearing? So it's just like really interesting and trying to look at how those resources were drawn on in their decision making. I'm going to move on to some of the other bits that parents drew on in terms of the employer context. So in conversations I've had it in employment context, sometimes it's like, we need to look at this, we need to look at parental leave, and it can be quite often, but that's a private choice, that's a private decision. That's not us, that's not about us. And my findings very much found that wasn't the case, that if an employer, depending on how an employer or the line manager is articulating or kind of showing supportive, I don't know, messages to their employer, really impacts on the decision making. And it wouldn't necessarily be that you're expecting at that time, but you might remember that kind of comments and things that have been said in the past. So many participants of my position, about half of them actually referenced experience of prejudice, either their own experiences or those they had witnessed. And sometimes it would be overt comments, sometimes it would be quite subtle behaviours. So mothers experienced sometimes like disapproval of taking time off or how long they were going to take off. So for example, Emma here, she remembered us previously, a senior manager, had said that they don't approve of a full year off paid leave. And it was only an informal chat, but that kind of stayed with her. When she did then she was then expecting, and that kind of impacted her decision making. Another mother reflected on, she wanted to share her leave with her partner, and the comments were, oh, why are you sharing? Why are you coming back so soon? Don't you want to take the whole year? Whereas fathers would they would also experience kind of prejudice, but in a slightly different way. And it would be like kind of a double take if you were saying that you were taking leave. And Gregory, I quite like this, he said, described feeling a bit like an exotic animal because he was taking 3 months leave. And they also talked about kind of lower kind of expectations, acceptance or support that they would have as fathers. And it was mothers that were reflecting on that as well as the fathers. And they talked about kind of like how those, the impact of that unconscious bias, prejudice, gendered expectations impacted their decision making, basically. So parents really, as well as talking about those experiences of prejudice, they also talked about the fiendishly complexity of the policy, especially shared parental leave. Like, you know, there'll be some examples of maternity leave you fill in one form, for shared parental leave you have to fill in four, or, you know, just how complex it was and how HR might have been kind of understanding and knowing maternity leave inside out, but didn't understand shared parental leave, and really the importance of the role of human resources and line managers, as well as the more proactive stuff around, you know, parent and carers networks, which is obviously really important in terms of the UK PACT and the work that the UK PACT is doing, but also like the case studies that can be kind of bring the policies to life, that kind of thing. And the difference between having a policy that's kind of on the shelf and that bringing it to life, you know, this is something that actually people can do. So just to finish off, yeah, the factors that are constraining parents and enabling parents is the policy barriers, so the eligibility and the finances. It's also around that kind of the norm, the culture, the organisational culture, where some fathers are sharing leave, they're experiencing prejudice, so it's kind of extending the risk that mothers are experiencing to fathers rather than removing that risk, which is what Nancy Fraser, when, you know, she's talking about a universal caregiver, that's what she's talking about, is removing that that risk for all parents. And yes, that the persistent of gendered parenting assumptions, how that kind of shapes the culture and what is imaginable and feasible for parents. And then I've just put in this, this is the article that I mentioned right at the beginning, the Higher Education Policy Institute, Show Me the Money. It's quite a good blog. If you haven't read it, take a look, because then it links. It doesn't only talk about parental leave, it talks about all different, the other bits, the recruitment, the promotions and the leadership bits, but also links the parental leave to the gender pay gap. So that's it. Thank you. Thank you for listening if you got to this bit. And thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Claire.
I will
Thank you
stop
so much.
sharing.
Thank you so much for your time. I will stop the recording now.